everyone. My name is Ashley Murphy, and welcome to Summit Debates Public Forum Topic Analysis for the January 2021 resolution. Today, we are going to be discussing Resolved. The National Security Agency should end its surveillance of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. So, our goals for today are to start with a basic background knowledge of this topic and of the history of the NSA. Then we are going to be outlining some potential pro arguments as well as some potential con arguments. Now, let's get started with unpacking the resolution. So, there are a few words that I've highlighted here that I think are important to really unlocking the arguments around this topic. The first is the word should. I think it's important to note that as debaters, we are looking at not the feasibility of whether the NSA or the government will do any of the things that we'll be talking about today, but instead whether they have the obligation to through that word should. I think it's also important to look at that word end and recognize that the pro is arguing for the complete stoppage of all surveillance on US citizens and lawful permanent residents. That end kind of gives a finality and makes the ground really clear for the pro as well as for the con. Now, the last two phrases I have highlighted there, I don't actually think are going to be particularly contentious within debates, but I think are important when you start that research process and you're really looking at kind of the impacts of this argumentation. And that's that we are looking specifically at surveillance as it deals with US citizens and lawful permanent residents, or LPRs. So, before we really dive into the arguments here, I think it's important to go ahead and get a quick timeline of events. I have noted here that this is an incomplete timeline because there are obviously many other points that have happened between 1952 when the NSA was established and today. I do have a link on the bottom here for anybody that's looking for a more comprehensive timeline. I would put the quick caveat that the people who have compiled that timeline do have a very clear kind of lens through which they are viewing this information, but they do a great job of sourcing all of the data points on that timeline. And so it can be a great jumping off place for really getting a comprehensive look at all of the different components as it relates to the NSA and surveillance. Just to kind of get us the highlights, though, let's start with at 1952, we have the NSA was established by President Truman. It actually evolved off of a group in World War II whose job was to intercept and be able to interpret communication, particularly looking at codes. And so, really, as the NSA came into being, its ultimate goal was to be able to collect communication and collect data around communication, interpret that communication, and then disseminate it to the appropriate parties. Now, within that first kind of 20 years of its existence, there were a number of people that brought up the concern that by having a designated group within the United States government that sole job was just collecting communication information, it was in fact going against the Fourth Amendment and infringing on the rights of US citizens. And so in 1978, Congress passes FISA, or the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which basically limits the NSA to collecting intelligence from people that were outside of the country. And if it involved US citizens needing to have a warrant and follow those kind of proper procedures in order to be able to collect that information. So, again, there are lots of things that happened between 1978 and 2001, but for our purposes today, we have a major shift in kind of the way that the NSA was used by the US government and the sort of prevailing ideas around data and security after 9/11. So when we have the tragedies that occurred on 9/11 and one of the largest terrorist attacks to ever happen on US soil, that largely caught the US government and all of those intelligence collecting agencies by surprise. There was really a shift in kind of the urgency for how much data needed to be collected and what needed to be done with that data. And so just under a month later, we have the Patriot Act that is enacted that greatly increased the ability for the NSA, as well as other organizations within the government, to be able to act in a way that was meant to protect the security of American citizens. Again, while the actual ethics of what they were doing versus what they should be doing can be debated. The ultimate goal here in 2001 was to be able to gather as much information and data as possible to try to protect American citizens and stop any future acts of violence or terrorism. And so there isn't a ton of pushback right in that immediate aftermath of 9/11. But as time goes on, there is a little bit more questioning about what information is being gathered and the methods that are being used. And so in 2006, we have a whistleblower from AT&T that leaks a bunch of information about how telecommunication data was being given to the NSA and infringing on the rights of US citizens. So this is the start of several lawsuits. And I would definitely recommend, as you were looking, especially if you were feeling like some of the overall arguments here are a little bit abstract, reading some of the notes on those cases can be super helpful because they really go through and kind of establish the harms that, at least within those lawsuits, that this data collection could have, as well as the rationale for why having this information either was benign or was going to be more beneficial. So I think diving into some of those lawsuits can be super helpful. But as we kind of move forward on our timeline, in 2007, the Protect America Act was passed. This is kind of an end of Bush era act that gave the NSA a lot more legal ability to do what it needed to do, and also was the start of the PRISM program, which was going to really start that mass collection of specifically the metadata when it came to communication. In 2008, there were amendments to FISA that were passed that allowed that warrantless domestic spying or domestic data collection. It is interesting to note that within those FISA amendments, there was also retroactive immunity that cleared the US government of any potential issues that sprung from those 2006 lawsuits, particularly that one with AT&T. The Supreme Court ended up deciding that they would not hear that case. So we continue on, and in 2013, we have the infamous Edward Snowden leaks. So this, again, is something that is, I'm not going to dive in a whole lot right now, but is something to definitely read up on before you are walking into these debate rounds. So Edward Snowden had released tons and tons and tons of information about the PRISM program and exactly what the US government was doing with how it was collecting data on its citizens. And there's a lot of literature that comes out of this time period for really evaluating what that data could be used for and some of the problematic areas that come up when we look at data collection within the United States government. In 2015, the Freedom Act was signed. So that's going to be an act that starts to curtail some of those amendments to FISA and really starts to look at restricting kind of that just complete open path for the NSA to collect data on US citizens. Again, there are lots more things that happen in this time period, but those are at least kind of those concrete touchstones that will be helpful in kind of having that background knowledge. So when we look at this resolution, most of the rounds that you're going to have are going to boil down to this idea of security versus privacy. And so as we were looking at these arguments, kind of thinking about, there are obviously lots of different nuances that will come from it, but in general, is it better for us to hand over our data to the NSA or have them be able to kind of pick through it at will with the idea that it will make us more secure as a country, versus how do our rights to privacy as citizens play in, and all of the rights that come from being able to act with free will and not worry about having to look over our shoulders for being watched or listened to or having that data used against us. I think it is also really important to note that because the subject of this debate is a secretive security organization that is notorious for being the most secretive of all of the aspects of the United States government, there are obviously gaps in the literature. As you're reading through, it's important to expect that there's probably going to be a fair amount of imbalance when it comes to diving into the literature, because the NSA doesn't typically explain or justify its actions. Instead, they will settle things legally. They'll look at passing acts that will kind of give them the authority that they need or get checked back with. But for security purposes, or for power purposes, depending on how cynical your view is, the NSA doesn't typically come out and say, hey, this is the reason why we're using this data, or here's how many terrorist attacks we have stopped. That's going to also become particularly important as debaters on the con side try to find their impacts, because you will likely not be able to find the same amount of concrete data for the lives that were saved, because most of that information about terrorist attacks that didn't happen aren't put out there for a variety of security reasons. So let's dive into some of these arguments. When we look at the pro side, I think one of the biggest stock arguments you're going to find is this idea of privacy and of individual liberty. So you might see some literature out there that talks about how kind of that over collection of data can lead to corruption, or can help feed a corrupt organization. There's also a ton of evidence for how that data can be misused and ultimately lead to negative consequences for citizens, or for the country as a whole, or for democracy as a whole. I think you can also look at how the collection of data and those programs create vulnerabilities. I know there are kind of specific programs that some of the literature has looked at for um, what like a few specific NSA programs have done to making our data as a whole less secure, but also just having a trove of that much information collected on US citizens in a world of hackers, or in a world where other parties are able to tap into that data or leak that data, all of a sudden puts US citizens and lawful permanent residents in an area where they are significantly less secure, even though the goal of that data collection was securitization. Another area that you can look at is this constitutionality line of arguments. So when you see that, the Fourth Amendment is something that is embedded in our Constitution to really make sure that we have those rights as citizens, that we are not treated as criminals, and that there is that idea of due process, that completely gets undermined when everybody is able to, or everybody is basically has their data surrendered without their knowledge. I think if you were looking at going more of the philosophical route, or even if you're not running philosophy in case, but kind of want to have a different way of being able to weigh those arguments, kind of looking into that panopticon and that idea of when you have a government that is totally obsessed with security and knowing everything that all of its citizens are doing at all times, it doesn't historically work out well for the citizens or for human rights as a whole. And so kind of looking at what we have built into our Constitution to protect from that kind of over securitization, and how that is undermined by this kind of limitless data collection, is something that can be potentially a really strong group of arguments to look at. Another area that is definitely worth checking out is the idea of racial profiling and the injustices that are caused. I think particularly when you look at the data that was collected post 9/11, oftentimes as while there are definitely programs that were just set up to collect large amounts of data from every US citizen indiscriminately, just everybody's data was handed over, there was additional data that was collected on individuals that were perceived as threats by the US government, which unfortunately oftentimes aligned more closely along racial, ethnic, or religious lines, rather than anything that those individuals had done to actually be a threat. And so I think there are a lot of really important implications here when you look at over policing, and just kind of the way that data can increase when it's selectively collected, can end up increasing biases and kind of increasing the negative impacts for everybody involved, just by virtue of focusing on and deciding that one portion of the population is a threat. Now, if we're switching sides here for a second and taking a look at the con arguments, I think one of the largest overall arguments that you're going to see on the con is that something that has to do with terrorism. And so when we look at the NSA's data collection, again, kind of dating all the way back to what the NSA evolved out of. The idea was to be able to stop violence by being able to intercept information and pass it on to the parties to be able to act appropriately. And so when we look at homegrown terrorism as being one of the top threats in the United States right now, being able to surveil US citizens is crucially important to being able to stop some of those plots, or at least that's how that argument would be run. It is helpful or important to know here that there are a number of data points that suggest that the United States government had all of the different pieces to be able to like know that 9/11, the attacks on 9/11 were going to happen before they happened. But unfortunately, because there wasn't a lot of interdepartment communication, they weren't able to connect those dots. And so having an organization whose job is to be able to go through and be able to collect and interpret that data as it relates to US citizens, some believe is critically important in being able to stop future attacks from being able to happen. Another argument that could potentially be run here is that when we look at surveillance on US citizens, it is typically low impact with high reward. There are definitely articles out there that talk about how there is deterrence that exists with or without interpreting that data. Now, again, there are definitely some disadvantages that come to that chilling effect when it comes to individual freedoms and liberties, and especially when that chilling effect is felt disproportionately throughout certain portions of the population. But the idea that you could potentially have your phones tapped or you could potentially have your emails read may act as a form of deterrence for some would-be criminals. The other kind of area that a lot of this argument falls into is that most of this collection would be benign. People don't know that their metadata is being read. It doesn't actually impact their lives in any way. And if they aren't doing something that is worthy of note for security purposes, there's nothing that's done with that data. It gets archived or deleted. Whereas the potential benefits of being able to stop a terrorist attack or stop a violent like group from being able to carry out what it would like to do is way higher in a result. Another way that you can kind of look at con arguments is saying that a ban itself is prohibitive. Completely stopping is something that isn't necessary because it can be solved by reforms. It can be resolved by, kind of going back to when we look at that initial reason that we had that FISA Act passed, as long as all of the protections that we have legally are being followed for US citizens, that's enough. We can still surveil them without infringing on rights. I think there are also other groups of people that talk about how information rights are already signed away. The fact that all of this data is already being collected for more capitalist reasons means that, if people are agreeing to those terms of service, the government should also be able to have access to that as well. All right, so now that we have kind of an idea of some of the directions you might want to go into, we can take a look at how should we get started. So some strategies to keep in mind as you prep. First and foremost, I would say know the literature. Again, I gave you a little bit of historical context in this video, but it is definitely worth making sure that you kind of go through and understand the different components that are being brought up. There's going to be a lot of acronyms that are used in this debate. And so even kind of making yourself a cheat sheet of what the different acts did or didn't do can be important so that when you're up there debating, you're able to use that information accordingly and in the right context. I think it's also really important with this topic to remember that judges are going to have scattered background knowledge, particularly your judges that are around parent ages that grew up and were around and reading the news when the Patriot Act was enacted, or were there when the Snowden leaks were happening and were really reading the news as that was coming out live. So it's important, I guess, in some ways it can be beneficial because judges may be more interested on this topic because it's something that connects to, a hot topic in the news, at least at different points in time. But it's also important for you to be able to check back with that as debaters to remember, A, don't over rely on the fact that they're going to know what you're talking about. And B, it means that your warranting is going to be so important. This is always true, but particularly when judges walk into the round feeling like they know certain sets of information, what they remember, what they actually know, where they were getting their information from, might not align with kind of the full story and everything that you've done with this deep dive of research on the topic. And so making sure that you really clearly explain how you're getting logically from one point to the next and then what those impacts are going to be is going to be critically important. Another thing to keep in mind is you want to get ready for that security versus rights or versus privacy debate. I think brushing up on philosophy, even if you don't actually use it in your case, can be super important because you can use it to frame your weighing. So, this is going to be a topic where util is probably not going to be as useful, especially like I said, you're not going to be able to get probably as many of those real hard numbers as to how many lives have been saved by like surveillance. So instead, we're really going to kind of be looking at, especially when we're seeing what the NSA should or shouldn't do, kind of more of those philosophical underpinnings. So being able to brush up, understand what the panopticon is, understand kind of that balance of securitization versus protecting individual rights will be helpful as you start to have those debates. All right, so that is all we have for now. Happy debating. Good luck with this topic, and I look forward to seeing you out there.